Hello and welcome to this episode of Teachers Talk Tech, an EdTech podcast by Cambridge University Press and Assessment for language teachers by language teachers on using technology inside and outside of the classroom. My name is Hajo Reinders. My guests today are André Hedlund, educational consultant, and Andrea Winkler from Cambridge University Press and Assessment. André and Andrea, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's a pleasure.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
Well, we have another wonderful and exciting topic for our audience today. Of course, as I always say, we always have exciting topics, but today is really quite special because we're going to be discussing, I think, a subject that for many of our listeners will be perhaps a little bit new and I hope quite thought-provoking, and that is educational sustainability. Not education about sustainability or education for sustainability, but educational sustainability. So let's just kick us off. What do we mean by this term, André?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I think about sustainability, I think the word that comes to mind is longevity. And I think longevity also in terms of a healthy growth, aligned with nature, aligned with the resources available. And that means that educational sustainability has something to do with the continuation, the preservation of education as we know it, as a powerful tool in society to help people grow and become better citizens and find solutions to the problems we have. So I think that's what comes to mind. It's really keeping education as something that is vital to help people change and something that is fundamental for society to actually work so that we can work together and find solutions to our problems.
No arguments here. Andrea, what do you think?
I could not agree more. Absolutely. I think to me, educational sustainability really focuses on approaches that ensure that we make the most of all potential resources in teaching and learning. And that, of course, very much includes technology in the classroom. But crucially, it really just emphasizes the long-term effects on all of its participants. And that really has to include teachers and learners as well as society in general.
Yeah, interesting. So you've both mentioned something to do with time, long-term longevity. You said, André, the word vital, of course, comes from Latin, vita, which means life. So something that is authentic to people, to natural organic forces, not to get too philosophical here, but I think it is a key component of sustainability, life sustaining. And Andrea, you mentioned that different people are involved and that the idea of sustainability is not an external thing, but it's inherent to learners, to teachers. Very, very interesting. So maybe just as a quick follow-up question, André, how is educational sustainability different from talking about sustainability in general? What makes it educational?
I think it's important for us to remember that education has helped us achieve more in terms of our own capabilities and potential as human beings. And I think educational sustainability should keep yielding those results somehow. And I think that we have come to a very important point, maybe a transition point in human history, that we're considering other forces and the impact that they might have on education. So education sustainability is different from sustainability because sustainability really relates to, preserving the planet, saving endangered species, and making sure that we have a home to live, a home planet to live on for future generations. But I think when it comes to education, we can still have an educational system in the future, but maybe if it's not according to what we understand really helps us achieve certain parameters, then what's the point? I think educational sustainability is about keeping education as a core, vital force for societies to thrive and for people to really reach that potential that we're thinking about, right?
Yeah, I like that perspective a lot. And of course, we're talking specifically in this podcast about the role of technology. So I think what you just said also closely brings us back to the potentially transformative, but also potentially very disruptive role of technology. It can be beneficial, but it can, of course, also be harmful. And I think in our discussion today, I think keeping the potential contributions positive or negative, of technology at the forefront is important, because there may be things that we can do at a technical level that actually go against, well, what Andrea, for example, said, that the different contributions that learners, teachers, society make, and that actually go against what we might wish as people to contribute to our futures. Andrea, any follow-up thoughts on that, or are we moving on to the next question?
I think, especially in the context of Gen AI tools, it is the human interaction, it is the human scaffolding from the teachers that make them really the most powerful tools and the most efficient tools. So I think in that respect, really keeping education sustainably at a high level, there has to be a human element, and therefore we have to really make that a priority, even with all the technological advancements around it.
Let's move the discussion from the fairly theoretical into the classroom, shall we say. Andre, what does doing educational sustainability look like in practice for you?
Well, I think it has everything to do with what Andrea just said, trying to focus on the human element, which is something that maybe we're not paying a lot of attention to nowadays because of all the technological advancements. I think one of the things that really scares me nowadays about how we've been engaging with, all kinds of tools, specifically AI, is that depending on how old our students are, they might not discern or be able to know if that's actually helping or not. And getting rid of the human element, or the human factor, as I like to call it, could be potentially quite dangerous. So we have to make sure that we can coexist, that we can help our teachers and our school managers and even families make the best decisions concerning their kids, their students, and their relationship with new technologies. And I think that's the only way we'll make education more sustainable. Otherwise, we're talking about replacing what we have and the human elements and the human factor with those tech tools. And I think that's not sustainable. That's just something that we should avoid.
It's really interesting to see how, especially when we are talking to teachers who are more digital teachers or who are pioneering teachers in using tech in the classroom, one of the common elements that we see in the way they are using tech or sort of digital tools in their classrooms is that they are very conscious of their use, and they don't use it just for the sake of using it. They have a very clear understanding of what the tool does, what the outcomes should be of that tool, and how it affects the learners in the classroom. So I think that's a great thing potentially to try out, is if you have any digital tools in your classroom, for example, do you know why you are using that? Is it because there is a hype around it, or is it because you really genuinely think that they enhance your teaching in the long run, and also because you think your learners will benefit from it?
Andre, I know that you have a strong interest and background in educational science, and in particular the role of the brain in all of this. And I just want to pick your brain, no pun intended, about the impact of technology, specifically on the way that we learn. Of course, technology can help us to achieve certain goals, so it's very good at supporting performance, but sometimes, as we're seeing from early studies now, at the expense of learning how to do things by yourself. So in other words, it helps performance, but it actually degrades learning.
When we learn, we have to build synapses in the brain. As simple as that. We have to create connections. We use our neurons, and basically when we learn something, that means we reinforce a neuronal network by using it again and again and again, and it becomes a very effective network, and then you can very easily retrieve whatever you have learned. Now, if there's something else doing that for you, you're not learning. You're not building those synapses in the brain. So if you're using generative AI to write an essay, and you're not even reading the essay, you're not thinking about, your arguments, you're not thinking about structure, you're not doing it, you're not learning. As simple as that. But at the same time, if you know how to use that same tech to give you feedback and to help you brainstorm and to maybe even, correct an early draft that you may have, then it could be very useful. But then there there's one thing that is crucial here. Can we trust our students to have that sort of self-regulated skill of knowing if that they have to do that, they have to go through that process, or should we check if they're just copying and pasting things from, ChatGPT, for example? So we have to be careful because they're kids, they're teenagers. They cannot inhibit certain impulses because their brains are still going through a maturation process. And so we have to be careful not to simply delegate whatever they have to do, trust that they will know how to use those tools, and then think that they're learning better because of that, because that's not the case, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Andre, this is probably a great example of what we mean by educational sustainability, because the technology can, of course, do a lot of the heavy lifting if you wanted to, but it would be at the expense of helping the learners to develop. And that, of course, is what we do not want to happen. So in order for the use of the technology to be educationally sustainable, you have to find ways for learners to use it with awareness and with a clear mind as to what they're using it for what purpose. And as you said, most learners need support in that. They need to develop that discernment, the ability to think about this critically. And most learners don't have that. So the role of the teacher in all this is, again, to use that word, absolutely vital. So Andrea, what does a teacher do to bring this into the classroom? Is educational sustainability that a teacher would or should talk about explicitly, or is it something that they somehow model through their teaching?
That's a really interesting question. And I think in some ways it does depend on the teacher and what feels authentic for them. But I would encourage not to worry about adding just another thing to the curriculum. It can sometimes feel like we are overwhelmed with all these frameworks and all these things that we should be looking out for and teaching our learners. I remember from my teaching experience as well, it sometimes felt like just a bit too much. And maybe focusing on elements that you already have in your teaching. So I think Andre's example was a great one to talk about digital literacy, for example, and some of those elements can be really easily introduced in an English language classroom. We have our life competencies framework here at Cambridge. One of the elements in there is digital literacy. So we have loads of practical resources that teachers could look into. Critical thinking is vital, just to keep coming back to this word really, and is really at the heart of educational sustainability, I would say. And I would also want to encourage thinking about these skills from a sustainability perspective in terms of technology and what happens when we don't have ChatGPT anymore, or when we don't have all of these Gen AI tools anymore. What we've just seen is really a boom in these tech tools, and they've changed a lot faster than we had ever thought they could change. And they've had this impact on the classroom and learners a lot faster than we thought they would. So if we don't teach critical thinking, digital literacy as generic skills in the classroom, the specific skills that might be necessary for these sorts of prompts, let's say at the moment, may not be relevant anymore in a very short amount of time. So in order to teach skills that will be sustainable for learners in the long run, so there is again the longevity there, we really need to be thinking about what will they use when there is the next step in the technological revolution.
Yeah, that is a great point. We always talk about lifelong learning, and this really is a great example of how to use the technology sustainably, in the sense that it has to prepare learners for a future that we don't know what it will look like yet. Just very briefly, Andrea, you mentioned the life competencies framework. Can you just briefly tell the audience what that is?
Yes, absolutely. The Cambridge Life Competencies Framework focuses on life skills or 21st century skills or global skills, whichever you prefer to use. And it has come to life based on teacher feedback on what they would want to see in the classroom, what they would want to teach in the classroom. And it's a framework which includes 6 main competencies and 3 underlying layers, foundation layers that support these competencies. And one of the foundation layers is digital literacy, and one of our competencies is critical thinking. And linked to that life competencies framework, we have a couple of others that focus on, again, as I've said before, soft skills or 21st century skills. And the other one that could be quite interesting or relevant for listeners is the sustainability framework for English language teaching that has sort of similar ideas. If teachers feel sort of unsure of how to really implement any of this in their classrooms, that might be a good one to start with as well, to just take a look at that framework and see what they think of it and what they might want to bring into their classroom from that.
So, Andre, in a very practical sense, I am listening to this conversation. I think this is great. I'm going to be an educationally sustainable teacher from Monday. I walk into the classroom. What's different? What do I do? How do I go about bringing this into my curriculum?
Well, I would love to recommend to all the listeners here to start looking for something called the science of learning, which you can also find it under different names, neuroeducation or educational neuroscience, educational psychology. One thing we have to teach our students, starting Monday, let's say, is to learn how to learn better. So we're talking about metacognitive skills, for example. And if they're not doing the hard work, the hard lifting, as you said, they're not doing it. If they're delegating that to a machine, to an AI, what happens when there's no power? What happens when we cannot access the tool? And that's very important. It's difficult. It's not easy. And I think we've bought this narrative that we have to facilitate things for students in the classroom. That is not actually true from a scientific, especially psychological perspective. We have this umbrella term that I like to mention. It's called the desirable difficulties. It's something that Robert Bjork, a cognitive psychologist, works with. And it's the idea that for something to actually work in terms of learning and teaching, for you to learn effectively, you have to make an effort, because that means you're building those synapses that I mentioned before. If it's too easy, then you're not making the right effort, or maybe you already know, so you're not learning anything new. There's a cost, right, from a brain perspective. And I think we need to teach those skills to our students, on Monday. So what if this doesn't work? What can you do? How can you change your approach? Where can you find more information? How can you present this in a different way? Not just assume that they know how to do those things because, well, they have access to everything. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite, I'd say. Nowadays, we have been looking at some data showing that students' IQ level is actually dropping, which is quite concerning. And it's because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So we have to teach them how to, get their hands dirty and do what they're supposed to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's process over product in a way, isn't it? You have to, as you say, put in the work. You have to commit the cognitive energy and experience a degree of suffering to get your reward. All right. So, Andrea, what would you say to teachers who would like to maybe begin by implementing this into the classroom? What would they do in class? Can you give us some examples of what might be different in class if a teacher is actively committed to developing educational sustainability?
So there's this activity in the sustainability framework activity card that I like a lot and actually use quite a lot in my everyday life as well, which is called I can't or I can't, depending on your accent, but I can. And it's a really interesting one because if you think about in terms of sustainability and educational sustainability, some things you do have to let go. So for example, I can't control whether tech works in my classroom. I can't use all the latest technology because we don't have enough resources at the school. But I can ask for help from my learners, for example. Maybe they know it better. Or I can create a community within the school and within the teachers in the school. And that way you could help each other understand these ideas a bit more. And crucially, it has a third bit. So I can't, but I can. And then the third bit of this sentence is, and if I do, then. And just understanding what the outcome is of these actions. What's the outcome of that action that I take in the classroom? If I let my learners choose their topic, maybe next time they will have more autonomy, more excitement in choosing what they want to learn. And even if it's going to be a bit frustrating or difficult, they will be more willing to do that themselves.
Yeah, I like that very much. Thank you for that example. It also reminds me a little bit of Carol Dweck's mindsets work, the idea where you don't say I can't, but you say I can't do whatever yet. There might be people listening to the podcast who are in situations where they feel that they do not have the ability, the autonomy, the freedom to make the curriculum more, or their teaching more educational. There may be people who say, well, I like these ideas, but in our school, the rules are very clear, they're very set. How do you negotiate that?
I talk to parents and directly to teachers and even school managers. And I think there's a structure in place and everybody's adopting whatever is trendy because it's what parents expect. I normally try to bring some data into the discussion and tell them, listen, when you look at some books and some papers that have come out recently, and I like very much Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation and Michel de Mourget's Screen Damage, because they look into really how neuroscience can help us understand and psychology. Students have become more anxious, more depressive in the last couple of decades because maybe they have lost that human factor, element, that social interaction element. So I normally try to convince them that, let's go back to basics. And I talk a little bit about Project Zero by Harvard, which I think it's exactly what Andrea was mentioning here when she said, I can't, but I can. That's a visible thinking routine, And I think we need to teach our students how to think by themselves, not use a tool to do the thinking for them. When they know how to think, then they can use the tool properly. And it doesn't happen, it's not the other way around. It's let's use the tool and then I'll learn how to do it. Now, first you learn the basics. You learn how to think. You learn how to study, how to prepare. And then whatever tool you have will help you achieve that goal.
Yeah, I think it was Picasso who said, you have to learn the rules before you can break them.
It's a really interesting balance, and in terms of using technology in the classroom, we might think that when we are talking about primary age learners or teenagers, we might expect them to be able to use digital tools just because they've grown up with them, and we see them use them in different scenarios on social media, in communicating, and we sort of expect them to be proficient users of these digital tools. But actually what we need is that we really need to be teaching these critical thinking skills, these mindful use skills, and help learners understand that just because they are using a digital tool, there are different layers of digital tool use. And the same tool and the same app or software can be used for very different purposes, depending on how we approach it, and really showing that to students and somehow having enough time in class to talk about that I think is essential.
Andrea, where do teachers go to learn more about this?
I would definitely recommend getting into the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework. We have resources for young learners, for teenagers, for adult learners. So if you feel like you really want to start early and you're teaching young learners, you could choose some of those activities. Even if you don't have access to tools or digital tools in your classroom, you could try some of these activities. Or if you feel more like reading up on the research, reading up on how other teachers feel, especially about AI or the usefulness of AI, you could take a look at some of our white papers. We've recently co-written a white paper with my colleague Sylvia Maczynska on the role of AI in language learning, and we talk a lot about personalization and learner autonomy in the context of AI. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about that, then feel free to take a look at that. And also the sustainability framework for English language teaching, and specifically what I feel most passionate about in there is about understanding agency and taking action towards a more sustainable future. So if you'd like to take a look at some of those activities, we will link that as well.
I like that idea of agency. I think that's something that many of us worry about disappearing for both our learners, but of course also for teachers. And I think thinking about your curriculum, your learners, with an educational sustainability lens really brings the human element back and actually puts it right at the center. Doing that is itself a process. That is actually also an example of something that you cannot just implement in one way using one tool. It's something that you as a teacher also have to develop, that resilience and that long-term perspective, both on your learners and yourself. Andre, any final words of wisdom?
I just wanted to remind everyone that there's a saying that goes back to maybe the turn of the last century: use it or lose it. It's something very important for neuroscientists because it's the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. So if you're not building those synapses, if you're delegating that process to something else, then you're not really learning.
All of these things that we've just talked about in this episode, none of that is possible without teachers. And teachers are the key to a sustainable educational system, not tech, not any of the digitals, none of those. It's teachers. And we really need teachers to look after themselves, to feel healthy and confident enough to be able to deal with all of these things. And I would just probably as a final thought suggest that if it all feels a bit too much, or if it feels too overwhelming to think about it in the classroom, just think about one step that you could take today towards this future. Just one tiny 5-minute thing. Think about that step and maybe think about one person to involve in that. Is that a learner? Is that a colleague? Is that a friend? And just take that maybe on Monday.
Beautiful. Well said. Andre and Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
It was so nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and check out the other conversations of the Teachers Talk Tech podcast by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.